Welcome to our deep dive into global warming. We're going beyond those headlines you always see to really try to get a good understanding of what's going on. Our source material lays out a very, very interesting but complex picture, and we're here to help you pull out those key points. We'll be covering the causes and effects, but most importantly, what we can actually do about it. Ready?
This podcast is created by Asiyeh from ACE IELTS with Asiyeh.
Absolutely. I think it can be easy to get lost in all the negative stuff, but this deep dive should hopefully equip you with not just the facts, but a good way to think about climate change.
Okay, so the source material starts off by comparing rising global temperatures to a heat-trapping blanket surrounding the Earth. I've heard about the greenhouse effect, but can you really explain that? How does that blanket analogy work?
It's a good way to think about it. Imagine those gases you hear about, like the ones in our atmosphere. They act just like fibers in a blanket.
Well,
let sunlight in, but then they trap some of the heat that would usually radiate back out into space. So it's like the thicker that blanket gets, the more heat that gets trapped, and that leads to, a gradual warming of the planet.
And that's where things like carbon dioxide and methane come in.
Right.
But the source material says even small increases in these gases can have a big impact over time. How small are we talking here?
Well, what's interesting is that we're not talking about like doubling or tripling these gases overnight, to see these huge changes. Even a small increase, like a fraction of a percentage point, it can really have an impact over time. It's like, think about adding, just a tiny thread to that blanket every year.
Yeah.
By itself, it doesn't seem like much, but if you do it over decades, it really adds up to a much thicker, warmer blanket.
So it's not even just about the amount of these gases, but the fact that we just keep adding more every single year.
Yeah. And this cumulative effect is key to understanding, why scientists are so concerned about even small increases in temperatures.
Okay, that makes sense. So the source material goes on to talk about how human activities are the main drivers behind making this blanket thicker and thicker. It mentions things like burning fossil fuels, deforestation, and agriculture. Can we break those down a bit?
Sure. Let's start with fossil fuels, burning coal, oil, and gas for energy. It's like we're pumping carbon dioxide straight into the atmosphere. Just think about all the cars driving around the planes in the air, all the factories working. They all release these heat-trapping gases.
And deforestation, that's cutting down trees, right? But how does that cause global warming?
Well, trees are kind of like nature's air purifiers. They take in carbon dioxide when they do photosynthesis and store it in their wood. But when we cut down forests or burn them, all of that stored carbon gets released back into the atmosphere, and that makes the blanket even thicker.
So we're basically getting rid of a way that the Earth naturally cools itself down.
Exactly. And then you have agriculture, which people don't always think about when they talk about climate change.
I've heard about livestock, especially cows producing a lot of methane. Is that what the source material is getting at?
Yeah, livestock farming, especially cattle, releases a significant amount of methane. But it's not just cows. You also have things like rice cultivation and the use of fertilizers all contributing to those greenhouse gas emissions.
So it's really a lot of different human activities, all connected and driving global warming. And the source material doesn't stop there. It really talks about the consequences and gives some pretty vivid examples that I found myself thinking about later.
The impacts of global warming, they're far-reaching and all interconnected. They affect everything from our weather patterns to the different ecosystems we have.
The source material starts by talking about rising temperatures. It says it's not just about things getting a little bit warmer, but about more frequent and intense heat waves. What kind of impact can we expect from those?
Imagine cities becoming so hot in the summer, with more people getting sick or even dying from the heat. It's the people who are already vulnerable, like the elderly or those with health problems, who will be especially at risk.
That's a scary thought. And it's not just human health. The source material also talks about how agriculture will be affected.
Yeah, intense heat can lead to entire crops failing, which would really affect our food supply and people's livelihoods. It'll hit the hardest in those regions that are already struggling with poverty and hunger.
It's almost like a domino effect. One change triggers a whole bunch of other consequences. And the source material says changes in precipitation patterns are another major concern.
That's right. Some areas are already dealing with more severe and longer droughts, which leads to water shortages, lost crops, and even conflict over resources. But at the same time, other regions are seeing more frequent and intense rainfall, causing floods and landslides and damaging infrastructure.
It really shows that climate change isn't just about things slowly getting warmer, but about our weather patterns becoming more unpredictable.
Exactly. And these changes in precipitation patterns can really have a huge effect on both ecosystems and our societies.
Another consequence that stood out to me was rising sea levels. The source material describes coastal cities being slowly swallowed by the ocean. It's almost hard to believe.
It might not happen right away, but the threat is definitely real. As glaciers and ice sheets melt and the ocean water expands because it's getting warmer, sea levels are rising, and that puts coastal communities, infrastructure, and entire ecosystems at risk.
The source material mentions melting glaciers and something called thermal expansion. Can you explain what those are and how they contribute to rising sea levels?
Well, think of glaciers and ice sheets as these massive frozen blocks of water, right? As temperatures rise, they melt faster, and that adds more water to the oceans. But at the same time, the ocean water itself is expanding as it warms up, and that also contributes to those rising sea levels.
Oh, okay, so it's sort of a double whammy, more water from melting ice and expanding ocean water. And the source material says this is a huge threat to coastal communities. What can we expect to see happen?
We'll see things like coastal erosion, more flooding, salt water getting into our freshwater sources and people having to leave their homes. Island nations and low-lying coastal areas are going to hit the hardest.
That's a good reminder that climate change isn't just an environmental issue, it's a human rights issue as well. The source material also points out another consequence that doesn't get talked about as much, which is ocean acidification.
Yeah, ocean acidification, it's a quiet threat, but it can have really devastating consequences for life in the ocean. As the ocean takes in more and more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, it gets more acidic, and that can mess up the balance of those delicate marine ecosystems.
I remember reading that ocean acidification is especially bad for coral reefs, which are often called the rainforests of the sea. Why is that?
Coral reefs are these incredibly diverse ecosystems that are home to so many species, and they also protect our coastlines from erosion. They're built by tiny little animals called polyps that make these calcium carbonate skeletons. But as the ocean becomes more acidic, it gets harder for these polyps to build and maintain their skeletons, which leads to coral bleaching and ultimately death.
So we're basically slowly destroying these amazing underwater ecosystems. And the source material continues on talking about how global warming is causing extreme weather events to happen more often.
Yeah, hurricanes, storms, wildfires, they're all becoming more intense and more frequent as the planet warms up.
I've definitely noticed that we seem to be seeing more extreme weather events in recent years. The news is always full of stories about terrible hurricanes and floods and wildfires.
Right, and these events are often connected to global warming. For example, warmer ocean temperatures give more energy to hurricanes, which makes them stronger, and then you have droughts that make everything super dry, and that fuels those wildfires.
The source material also talks about how ecosystems are affected by global warming. What kind of changes are we seeing there?
Global warming is messing up the delicate balances in nature. We're seeing shifts in where species live, changes in migration patterns, and in the end, we're losing biodiversity.
It's like we're slowly unraveling the web of life, and we have no idea what the consequences will be. It can all feel so overwhelming and hopeless, But the source material reminds us that we're not powerless in the face of this challenge.
That's right. We actually have the knowledge, the technology, and the will to tackle global warming and create a better future. It's not about giving up. It's about understanding what's happening and taking action.
That's a great message of hope, and it makes me feel like we can actually do something about it. Let's talk about those solutions in our next segment. All right, so I'm ready to move on, from the what is to the what can we do about global warming. The source material talks about a lot of solutions, from individual actions to, global policy changes. Where should we start?
Well, it's true, the scope of the solutions is vast, but that's actually a good thing. It means we have many ways to take action, whether it's making changes in our own lives or government setting national policies.
That's a good way to look at it. It feels less overwhelming that way. The source material highlights that we need a multifaceted approach, There's no single solution that will fix everything. Are there certain areas that are especially important?
Absolutely. The source material really emphasizes the need to move away from fossil fuels and quickly, and towards renewable energy sources. It argues that this shift is fundamental to fighting climate change.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, fossil fuels, they've been our main source of energy for so long, but they're also the main source of those heat-trapping emissions. What are some of the main ways we can make this transition happen?
There are a few key things we can do. One is investing in renewable energy technologies, like solar, wind, and geothermal. These technologies are becoming more efficient and affordable all the time, making them good alternatives to fossil fuels.
I've definitely seen a lot more solar panels popping up on roofs and wind farms out in the country. But the source material also talks about government policies being really important. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, governments can create policies that encourage people to develop and use renewable energy. For example, they can offer tax credits to homeowners who put solar panels on their houses, or give money to companies investing in wind farms. They can also set targets for how much energy should come from renewable sources. This sends a clear message that clean energy is the way of the future.
So it's all about creating the right environment for renewable energy to grow.
Ace the IELTS with Asiyeh.
But what about those industries that are harder to make clean, like heavy industry or aviation? The source material mentions something called carbon capture and storage.
Yeah, CCS is a pretty promising technology for those industries where it's really tough to eliminate all those emissions.
Yeah.
It basically involves capturing the carbon dioxide that comes from power plants or industrial facilities and then storing it underground. This stops it from getting into the atmosphere.
So it's like a backup plan for those emissions we just can't get rid of. Is this technology something we can really use on a large scale? Can it really make a big difference in those global emissions?
CCS is still pretty new, and there are some issues like the cost, scaling it up, and making sure those storage sites are safe in the long term. However, it's got a lot of potential, especially for those industries where there aren't many other options.
It sounds like we need a mix of new technology, government support, and maybe even some outside-the-box thinking to really decarbonize our economies. But the source material also talks a lot about individual actions. What can we do in our daily lives to help with this transition?
What individuals do really does matter. Sure, we need big changes to deal with a huge problem like climate change, but all of our choices together can have a huge impact.
What are some of the best things we can do?
A great place to start is cutting back on how much energy we use. Think about simple things like using energy-efficient appliances, taking public transportation, or riding a bike instead of driving alone, and just being aware of how much electricity we're using.
Those are things I can definitely do. I've been meaning to finally switch those old light bulbs to LEDs. The source material also talks about changing how much we buy and cutting back on waste.
That's another big area where people can make a difference. Choosing things with less packaging, buying stuff that will last longer, and fixing things instead of throwing them out. All of these things help.
And how about recycling and composting? I try to do my part, but sometimes it's confusing.
Recycling and composting are super important for keeping stuff out of landfills, because when that stuff decomposes, it releases methane, which is a really bad greenhouse gas.
It's like we're closing the loop on the things we use, keeping them around for as long as possible. The source material also mentions sustainable eating as a way to reduce our impact on the climate.
Right, the food we eat really affects the environment. Meat production, especially beef, uses a lot of resources and causes a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. We can lessen that impact by eating less meat and adding more plant-based meals to our diets.
I've been trying Meatless Mondays, and I've actually found some really great vegetarian recipes. It's fun to try something new.
That's great. It's all about making little changes, and finding what you like.
Besides doing things ourselves, the source material also talks about speaking up and raising awareness about climate change. What does that look like in real life?
It can be a lot of different things. It could be just talking to your friends and family about climate change, sharing information on social media, or even writing to your elected officials to tell them what you think and push for policies that are good for the climate.
It's all about using our voices to spread the message and create that sense of urgency. The source material also says that while individual actions are important, they're not enough to solve a global problem like climate change on their own.
Yeah, that's true. We need systemic change. We need governments to create bold policies to promote things like renewable energy, regulate emissions, and invest in getting ready for the impacts of climate change.
The source material talks about the Paris Agreement and how it was a really important moment for international cooperation on climate change.
The Paris Agreement brings almost 200 countries together, with the goal of limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, preferably 1.5 degrees Celsius, compared to pre-industrial levels.
So it's like a global promise to work together to fix this problem. But the source material also mentions that some people say the agreement isn't enough, that we need to be doing more and faster. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's true that what countries are currently promising to do under the Paris Agreement isn't enough to meet those temperature goals. But the agreement gives us a way to take action and a process for making those commitments stronger over time.
So it's a step in the right direction, but we need to keep pushing for more.
Absolutely. The science is clear,
Mm.
We need to drastically cut emissions this decade to avoid the worst effects of climate change. There's no time to waste.
The source material also talks about climate adaptation, which seems to be getting more attention these days.
Adaptation means accepting that climate change is happening now and taking steps to be ready for it and minimize the damage.
Can you give us some examples of what that means in real life?
It can be all sorts of things. Building seawalls to protect coastal communities from the rising sea level, developing crops that can survive droughts to make sure people have food in areas with water shortages. It's all about making sure our systems can handle the changes that are coming.
So we're not just trying to prevent climate change, but also getting ready for the changes that are already happening. The source material goes beyond just the technical stuff, though. It also talks about the importance of a fair and just transition to a sustainable future.
Yeah, that's a crucial point. The effects of climate change are worse for vulnerable populations, even though they've contributed the least to causing the problem. A just transition means making sure those communities aren't forgotten, that they have a say in decisions and that they benefit from switching to a clean energy economy.
It's about recognizing that social justice and climate change are linked. What are some ways to make sure this transition is fair for everyone?
It involves dealing with issues like access to clean energy, affordable housing, job training, and healthcare, especially in those communities that have been historically marginalized or disadvantaged. It's about making sure everyone has the chance to do well in a sustainable future.
It's about understanding that climate change isn't just an environmental issue, it's a human rights issue. This is a lot to think about. We've talked about so much in this segment, from getting off fossil fuels to international agreements and making sure the transition is fair. As we go into our final segment, what would you say is the most important thing for our listeners to remember?
The biggest takeaway is that while the problem of global warming is huge, we have the knowledge, the technology, and the will to do something about it. It requires action at every level: individual choices, government policies, international cooperation.
So now's the time to act, not to feel defeated.
Exactly. Everything we do, no matter how small, helps to create a more sustainable future. It's about understanding that we're all in this together, and what we do today will shape the world we leave for future generations.
That's really encouraging. I'm excited to learn more about what those individual actions look like in our last segment. Let's dive in. All right, so in this final part of our deep dive, I want to dig deeper into those individual actions we talked about earlier. It's easy to feel like what we do as individuals doesn't really matter when you're facing such a big global problem. But the source material really highlights how powerful collective action can be.
Yeah, it's true. One person's actions might seem tiny, but when you have millions or even billions of people making those same choices, it really adds up. Think of it like voting. Each vote helps to decide the outcome. In the same way, each sustainable choice we make moves us closer to a more sustainable future.
I like that analogy. It makes it feel like our choices actually make a difference. But there are so many things we could do. Where should we focus our energy? What are some of the most impactful things we can do as individuals?
Well, let's start with something we do every day: eating. Like we talked about earlier, the food we eat really impacts the environment. The source material talks about cutting back on meat, especially red meat, as a big way to make a change.
I've been trying to eat more plant-based meals recently. It's been easier and tastier than I thought. But I'm curious, why is meat production, especially beef, so resource-intensive?
Well, raising cattle takes a ton of land, water, and feed. And cows produce methane as part of their digestion, which is a really strong greenhouse gas. So eating less meat can make a real difference in your carbon footprint. It's not about becoming vegan overnight. It's about making choices like skipping meat a few times a week or trying plant-based versions of your favorite foods.
It's about finding what works for you and making changes slowly. The source material also talks about being careful with how much energy we use, especially at home.
Absolutely. Our homes use a lot of energy, and that means they produce a lot of emissions. Things like switching to more efficient appliances, using LED light bulbs, and turning off lights when you leave a room. All of that adds up.
It's about paying attention to how we're using energy and finding ways to use less without making our lives harder. I just got a smart thermostat, and it's crazy how much energy I've saved by setting the heating and cooling on a schedule.
Yeah, technology can help us make our homes a lot more efficient. And it's not just about the appliances themselves, it's about how we use them. Washing clothes in cold water, letting laundry air dry, instead of using the dryer, unplugging electronics when we're not using them. These are all small things, but they make a difference.
It's about changing our habits and thinking about how we're using energy every day. And what about transportation? Cars are a big source of emissions, but not everyone can use public transit or walk or bike everywhere.
Transportation is tricky, and the solutions are different for everyone depending on where they live and their situation. But even if you can't give up your car entirely, there are things you can do. Carpooling, using public transportation when you can, and choosing a fuel-efficient car all help.
And for those who can, walking, biking, or taking the stairs instead of the elevator are all good ways to get some exercise and lower your carbon footprint.
Right. It's about finding ways to be more active and not rely on cars so much for short trips. And if you're thinking about getting a new car, electric vehicles are becoming more affordable and available, and they're a much cleaner option than gas-powered cars.
It's great to see more electric cars on the road. The source material also talks a lot about reducing waste and recycling.
The way we consume things has a big impact on climate change. The more we buy, the more resources are used, the more energy is consumed, and the more waste we create. So being thoughtful about what we buy is really important. Think about whether you really need something before you buy it. Choose products with less packaging. Buy things that will last a long time and try to fix things instead of just throwing them away.
I've been trying to be more careful about what I buy, thinking about where it came from and what will happen to it when I'm done with it. And it's been cool to see how much stuff you can find secondhand or refurbished.
That's a great way to do it. Making things last longer by fixing them, reusing them, or even upcycling them is a really good way to create less waste and lessen our impact on the environment. And when you do need to get rid of something, recycling is important. It lets those materials be used again and keeps them out of landfills.
I love to recycle. I've gotten really good at sorting my trash and knowing what goes where, but I'm always learning new things, like how some things can't be recycled in my regular bin and I need to take them somewhere special.
Yeah, recycling rules are different in different places. It's always a good idea to check with your local government to make sure you're doing it right. Oh, and don't forget about composting. Food scraps and yard waste can be composted to make really good soil for your garden, and that means less waste going to landfills.
Composting has been a fun thing to try. I started a compost bin in my backyard last year, and it's pretty amazing to watch food scraps turn into something useful. Besides all these things we can do ourselves, the source material also talks about speaking up and advocating for change. What are some ways we can do that?
There are tons of ways to advocate. You could talk to your family and friends about climate change, share information on social media, write letters to your elected officials, or support organizations that are working on climate solutions.
It's about raising awareness, getting people talking, and making sure those in charge are doing their part. And I think it's important to remember that it's not about being perfect, it's about making an effort. We're all in this together, and we can learn from each other and support each other.
Exactly. It's not about feeling bad. It's about taking action. Every choice we make, every conversation we have, every action we take helps to create a better future. It's understanding that our individual actions have a ripple effect, and together we can make a big difference.
I like that image of a wave of change. It feels hopeful and inspiring. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to thank you for sharing your knowledge and insights. It's been really interesting to explore the complexities of global warming, the challenges we're up against, and the solutions we can work towards.
The pleasure was all mine. Remember, we all have a role to play in creating a more sustainable future. It starts with understanding the problem, making smart choices, and taking action in our own lives and communities.
And it's not about waiting for someone else to fix it. It's about understanding that we are the solution.
Every single one of us can make a difference. So let's keep learning, keep talking, keep acting, and keep pushing for a better future for ourselves and everyone who comes after us. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.